for Shiral's sound and not getting it.
Oh, so yeah, the recording is on now, so you can start.
Okay, start. Welcome everybody to the session on prioritization. For anybody who's new, our slides and textbook, same thing. And this QR, we'll take a quick photo of it. This will get you the book, Systems Engineering Architecture, or C. And on the bottom of every page is the link to the book. And if that doesn't work, write me an email and I'll send you the link or the book. We're making a video of everything, including today. We're working on getting the videos up with one link to all videos, but here's a link to an earlier video on the first page. Here's an overview. We've been through 1, 2, 3, 4, etc., plus an introduction, 5 sessions. And now we're at chapter 5, Architecture Prioritization. During this, I'm going to refer to chapter 12, Detailed Impact Estimation. And maybe we'll run a session on that later. We haven't quite decided what we do at the end here, but you can at least read about impact estimation tables in chapter 12 in quite some detail. Having said that, we're going to then go to just skipping through everything. We did decomposition last time, which is a prerequisite. When you decompose your architecture, you can then choose which small sub-architectures to implement early in agile sprints or value deliveries, as I prefer to. Here's some of the architecture decompositions we looked at on Tuesday for those who want to catch up. But we're going to assume we've decomposed. We're going to look at the prioritization stuff. There we go. Chapter 5, prioritization. Okay. And see, I'm trying to move this thing there out of my way, right? Okay, so there's, by the way, you might want to get some more details on this subject, my big fat book, Value Planning. And last week we had a chapter on decomposition, about 51 pages. This week we have a free chapter on only 19 pages, managing priorities. Sorry, the value planning book is 60 pages. It sounds more like it. There's the link. And there's a nice shorter paper on managing priorities, the key to systematic decision making. So that's sort of background. You'll find both of those at the in the references at the end of the C book. And there's one major idea we're going to deal with today, and it's the idea that prioritization is not a matter of fixed opinions or fixed weights. Many people even mix up the concept of a weighting on the one hand and the process of prioritization on the other. I'm very interested, and agile people are very interested in prioritization, doing the smartest thing on the next step. But I believe that fixed weights, as are applied in many methods, for example, balanced scorecard and quality function deployment, are actually a very bad idea in large and complex systems where you'd be talking about enterprise architecture. So I'm going to introduce the idea of dynamic prioritization of the architecture. In other words, we decide on our priorities at each and every step based on the feedback in the situation. So that's the whole main idea, dynamic prioritization rather than static prioritization. Here's one of the better management authors of all time, Peter Drucker, and his quotation is very clear. It's about not doing work, i.e., for example, coding a user story, producing some code, but it's about the results and the measurement of results and accountability, who is responsible for those results. That, in my view, is what is missing from most versions of Agile out there. And then feedback from the results, what's really happening as opposed to what you planned to happen, results in modifying the planning process itself. So this is really an excellent description of what Agile should be: result-based feedback and learning. Okay, so I like that. Now I'm making some assumptions, and if an assumption isn't true, maybe this method isn't for you, but that number one, you would want to take the best architecture choices, both in the short term and in the long term, even if you have to work a little bit harder to get them. In other words, if you just set some fixed weights and go with them, then no hard work, you won't have to reevaluate your priorities at each step. But if you take the trouble to reevaluate your priorities at each delivery step based on, and that means you have to measure several things: the costs, the values delivered, compare them to the plans you have. That's extra work, but if you do that, you will tend to get much better architectural choices as you go and in the long run. You won't be, for example, locked in to an architectural choice 3 years hence, when in fact it makes no sense any longer to take that choice. You might like your prioritization decisions, and that's where you're going to spend money and where you're going to get results and who you're going to deliver them to be transparent, either because your organizational culture or the law demands transparency, what's going on, who's making the decisions, and things like that. No hidden decisions. If you want to speed up the delivery of value, then choosing the smartest architecture means choosing the architecture with the most value or set of values. Okay, and but you cannot make those decisions in advance because you don't really know how a major architectural component will work. You need to try out some sub-components of it, see how they work, adjust the whole overall architectural idea if necessary to make it work better. And those are things you just don't, or even discard it and replace it with a similar but better architecture. So you might also like to minimize the time, money, and people, the resources necessary to deliver your value. I call that resource minimization. And to do that, you need to measure how much resource was used step by step in relation to your expectations. If you're expecting to spend a week and you spend 5 weeks, maybe you need to reconsider your architecture and design to cost and find an architecture that's 5 times cheaper, try it out. And that's the kind of thing an architect has to do to minimize resources. If you just go with the architecture you have, and in fact, if it has disappointing resource results, then you're stuck with it for the entire project, and your 8-year Axon project will take 24 years or something like that. So we have to, assuming you're very interested in resource minimization, that means you're going to have to learn the truth of the resources, however unpleasant, and change architecture. Architecture contains the values, and it contains the resources you're going to have to spend to get them. So choice of architecture is a tool for minimizing total long-term and short-term resource. Your environments might, upon getting steps delivered, be very unhappy with them. A simple little example everybody in Norway knows about is that as soon as the smittestop COVID virus app was delivered, people began to wake up to the idea that privacy was not guaranteed. And then the social environment had a big reaction, the legal environment, the government had a reaction, and the whole project was dropped or wasted. So we might have to learn certain things, and we might have to constantly, step by step, learn. That's the whole point of Agile, after all. And so we might have to change our priorities. For example, the priority for privacy or GDPR was radically changed as a result of the social environment waking up and saying, you've got to be joking. We can't have that misuse of our or violation of the GDPR. Okay. It would be very nice to know who is responsible for making decisions. I find whenever I look at decisions that are made for prioritizations that it's highly anonymous. I very rarely see the name of the individual or the team or the group or the power that said, this is our priority. It's just done. It has a weight on it, like 4 stars in, or 4 units in balanced scorecard. But there is no space for annotating who made the decision or why. And I think this is back to the transparency idea, but it's something different. Is responsible? I mean, if things go wrong, who is responsible? Will Donald take responsibility? Will the Senate make him responsible? Probably not, but we'll see by Saturday, won't we? Now, you're probably going to want to have a policy, which I will suggest later, for prioritization. For example, do you want a policy of maximum value delivered, or would you like a policy of maximum value for money, or value for several kinds of resources, or value for resources with regard to risk? There are lots of different policies, and you might want to pick one or more or vary your policies. And if you want to check that the policies are being followed, we need to have transparency and responsibility. Otherwise, management can state a policy, but nobody needs to bother to follow it. Okay. I believe that the whole issue of prioritization is one that can be computed based on numbers for how much value, how much resource, how much risk, and that a set of the data or numbers, both the ones in the plans and the feedback, can automatically compute our current priority. In other words, what we're going to do the next sprint. And wouldn't you like to integrate your prioritization with all other digital planning and not leave it to, say, a product owner to sort of make a wild guess and say, I think we ought to do that. So basically, you would like to automate where you can automate. And if you're going to do 100 agile steps, you might like to make sure that you don't have a 1 week of meetings and discussions before you prioritize, but that is automated according to your policy, according to your data. It's a quick and pretty safe decision. And the 10th assumption is that you are agile, you want to be agile, you want rapid response to any kind of change, the external circumstances, the goodness of your architecture, and things like that. I heard a little sound in the background. Was that somebody trying to make a remark? No? Okay. So Jimmy Dean, not James Dean, had a wonderful quotation I bumped into, and why he of all people should have such a lovely quotation, I don't know, but probably he sailed sailboats. I can't change the direction of the wind. These are all these forces like the EU laws and the government and the budget, but I can adjust my sails to always reach my destination. The destination is the set of critical stakeholder values that you're trying to deliver by the means of your architecture, but adjusting the sails is this prioritization process. So I thought that was a wonderful little sailing analogy, what we're talking about. Now, here are what I call the mechanics, the tools of my architecture prioritization, the dynamic one. First is, as we talked about earlier, that we have quantified our critical stakeholder value requirements. This means, for example, we've quantified our qualities like security, user friendliness, maintainability, technical debt, and any other values we have, such as the privacy value or organizational flexibility, anything that the critical stakeholders say they want are side. We may have prioritized only dealing with the top 10 of maybe 30 or more important things we're going to do sooner or later. But that's just a short-term prioritization mechanism, the top 10 value requirements. And when we've worked them and achieved them, we will prioritize the next 10 or so requirements to work on them until they're done. We also have to articulate our resource limitations, our budgets, our deadlines, both in short term, say this year, long term, by the end of the Axon project in 8 or 24 years. And now everybody knows you can quantify these things. Here, people have problems. But we believe and we profess that you can always quantify all of the value requirements. If in doubt, Google them and find out how to do it, okay? What we find is that although people can set budgets, they often, for example, in the architecture process, often you don't find clear integration of the resource budgets for money and time, or for example, annual expenditure as opposed to capital expenditure. They're just not part of the architecture process. It's almost as though we have a strategy that says, find the architecture and then estimate the total cost, 22 billion for Axon, and then go and do it no matter what. And that's silly. You want to use your architecture to fit within desirable and necessary deadlines and budgets. That's your design to cost we talked about earlier. We also have to know our constraints. You know, is the European law GDPR for privacy valid for the Smithisstop project? Yes or no? Some people don't take that very seriously either. So this set of things is the basis for making priority decisions. Now, what can we choose? What can we prioritize? Well, first we can prioritize any architecture. Let's say we have a top 10 architectural ideas. One of them might be to buy a completely new system or build a completely new system or reuse the old system to some degree. Those would be really big architectural decisions. And sub-architectures would be subsets of this, as we discussed last Tuesday in the decomposition session. But we can also choose to work with certain stakeholders, like those who have already tested positive for COVID. Or today I got my shot, Moderna, by the way. And so you might choose all those who have been vaccinated first time. Okay, those are examples of choosing stakeholders. We can also choose certain values, like let's go for increasing the availability of the system or reducing the technical debt or something like that. So you have all kinds of choices of what you're going to prioritize and what you're going to use. And we have. What are going to be our decision policies? Well, first, what about objectivity and truth? Something the former president of the United States doesn't believe is a good way of doing things. And after all, he's very successful at becoming president and retaining power. So that, evidence, forget it, don't believe in evidence. So, but I personally, I really like the idea of being objective and finding the truth and getting good evidence. Another thing is, I believe it's very important to consider multiple factors simultaneously. So multiple factors could be 5 of the top 10 values, or 3 of the top 10 values and 2 of the costs. But it's not just 1 to 1. It's not just we're going for security, therefore, let's see. double passwords are a good idea. That's one-to-one thinking, and there's too much of that going on. Okay, so the values are the primary consideration. That's the whole. Values are, in my opinion, the major reason for all projects and therefore all enterprise architecture efforts. But the resources are pretty important. The little automation, which, as far as I'm concerned, should be the norm. It's fairly simple. We'll see how to do it. But you might have a situation where the automated system of planning gives suggestions, but humans, such as the boss, can override the suggestions. Very much like the health departments in Norway give suggestions, but the government might decide to override them for their political considerations. Not unusual at all. We might, yeah, okay. So sorry, this one was the computer gives automatic suggestions, but humans have to approve them. Here is the fact that the computer gives options, but humans can make other choices, is the third option here. Okay. And sometimes when we deviate from the advice in the system, we might have a requirement to document the justification and who is responsible for going outside the normal framework of, say, value to cost choices. We might choose value even for high cost in order to make a politically good impression on our stakeholders. I've done that early in projects quite intentionally. Okay, and finally, but in the future, I'm not there yet. But since we can compute and use data, we can and have lots of feedback. We can learn. We can use some artificial intelligence to learn things like, for example, which of these choices, which of the values, which of the costs, which of the risks we should pay more attention to because it seems to give better results in the past. Okay, so lovely little quotation from one of the second president of the United States, John Adams. Facts are stubborn things, and whatever may be our wishes, our inclinations, or the dictates of our passions, they cannot alter the state of facts and evidence. Interesting. I'm going to have fun this evening looking at the evidence being presented in the Senate. Don't know about you. I spent all yesterday evening there. Okay, so here are some fundamental principles of architecture prioritization. I believe that any subject like decomposition principles are guidelines, my advice, if you like, and short and summarized advice to guide us into making intelligent prioritization methods, policies, and finally, decisions. Okay, so principle number one is a very general principle. If you have infinite resources, you don't have to prioritize so as not to run out of time or money, because you've got infinite time or money. So it's exactly the fact that we have a budget and we have a deadline, and that caused us to prioritize so that we deliver sufficient quantity of our values by the time the deadline hits us or the budget end hits us. Okay, so and principle number two, to have fixed weights, which I call static initial prioritization, is unrealistic because things change. Principle number three, you need to have adopted a clear prioritization policy, although it can change and it can vary depending on the phase of the project you're in. The beginning is very different from the very end 8 years later, for example. But do you have a policy for prioritization? It could just be let the boss decide. That would be one. It could be let anonymous people decide by setting fixed weights. That's probably even worse. No responsibility, no traceability. But it could be that the quantified stakeholder value delivery should be maximized no matter what the cost. See? But it could be the quantified value for the top 3 values should be maximized, but in relation to the capital cost, even if the time is a bit different. So you get all kinds of combinations of, if you like, values, costs, risks, responsibilities. But you do need to have a policy, and you do need to consciously change the policy as needed. The most useful general policy, if you like, starting policy, is bangs for bucks. In other words, maximize the values, for example, the top 10 quantified value delivery towards our goals. In relation to bucks, it really means dollars, but I'm using it to symbolize any kind of resource, time, people, money, storage space, and things like that. So values for resources is a pretty good general principle. However, and I don't know if it's here, yeah. However, bringing in risk, for example, some estimates of the cost could be highly risky and some could be highly certain, like they could be fixed price in a contract. And so you might like to bring in the concept of how uncertain or certain are your estimates, which I do. Look at the chapter 12 on impact estimation tables to find exactly how we bring in risk to this equation. But whatever it is, you need to make a conscious and clear choice, and you need to be able to change, modify, or vary that choice as you go along. Here's another reminder of that same value planning chapter 6 on prioritization, where these principles are discussed in more detail. In fact, there are about 60 pages there. So there's in fact about 10 pages on each one of these principles there. If you want to say, this went too quickly, what did Tom really say? I recommend take one principle, read 10 pages as the exercise. Principle number 6, I believe you need to have data-driven prioritization decisions. In other words, not subjective, not the boss feels like that's a nice thing. That's not a data-driven decision, that's a subjective personal decision. And maybe we need to even convince the powers that be that they would like to be data-driven rather than have to be responsible for making a personal decision which they will deeply regret later and be embarrassed by. Okay. The impact estimation table is a basic tool for seeing your prioritization options, seeing the data we're talking about here, and allowing the computer to prioritize, to pick out which sprints should go early. And it can help you with both short-term prioritization, what are we going to do next sprint, and long-term prioritization, which major architecture are we going to start working on next year, or something like that, or towards the end of the project. So both short-term and long-term value prioritization are possibilities here. It's very useful to make estimates in the impact estimation table for what is it going to cost, how much value do we think this architecture will give us. But as we begin to get feedback about what things really cost sprint by sprint and what value they really give, then we need to modify everything as a result of real values. I think the way Norwegian government and some other governments are handling COVID is a very good example of this. They start off with the data they have, but I was just listening to the Serbian prime minister on CNN today saying that we're making decisions hour by hour here. Okay, so that sounds very agile to me. And we know at least the Norwegian government is certainly doing that, several times a day if necessary. So let's see. Now, principle number 8, if you have the data there and you have a policy you've decided, like maximize values, then the priority can be computed using the table, using a spreadsheet, for example. Okay, and that's what they're for. Nature has a kind of priority, and that is make sure that the organic system is working pretty well. You know, your brain is sort of functioning and your heart is sort of beating and your temperature isn't too cold. So these are all the critical factors in your body, and that's called survival. And I believe there are 2 basic levels of any value and, in fact, any resource. And one is the minimum necessary. So our initial prioritizations need to try to get all the values to the minimum necessary. We call that the tolerable level. That's the specific level on a scale of measure. Read the chapters, I think 10, 11 of the book here. Now, once all critical values are in survival mode, we can prioritize to start moving towards the targets. These are the success levels. We call them a goal, okay? And so in other words, that's the way nature prioritizes things. So for example, when you've eaten enough and you've slept enough and you've drunk enough, going beyond that doesn't have any value. And so you need to learn to, that's the stopping point. You cannot prioritize things that have already reached a maximum necessary for success. But if you were to prioritize 9 out of 10 values reaching their survival level, and then one of them doesn't reach survival level yet, but you start using your resources to get to the dreams, the success and the goals, you could risk running out of resources before you even got to your goals, but you still have one of your critical values that is not satisfactory. For example, the availability of the system is still down at 1%, in which case you have a dead system, even though you have 9 values that are a satisfactory level. So you have to simultaneously measure all critical values and get them to their survival level, their tolerable level. Then and only then can you dare to start using resources to move them towards their dreams, success, or goal levels. And when you reach all of your goal levels, it's time to stop using resources. In other words, give the money back, declare victory early, and things like that. Okay, so 10 deep principles. Again, I remind you, I've spent 60 pages, 10 pages on each of these roughly, discussing this. So if you say that looks interesting, but it went a bit fast for me, that's fine. That's why I wrote 60 pages about them, and it's at this download site right here. And Tom's going to drink a little water. Or vodka, you will never know. So here's somebody most of you probably heard of, Isaac Asimov, science fiction writer. Let's go down here because this is kind of fun. The saddest aspect of life right now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. Very interesting. I'm reading a book called, what is it? Goodness me, capitalism. But it's all about Google and Amazon and Facebook. What is it? Not sustainability, capitalism, but it's exactly about that these companies that are ripping off your personal data for their own property, they are much faster at doing that than society can make laws to actually protect the privacy from being invaded. Okay, so that's pretty wise. Anyway, the real reason I picked this quote is that this guy believes in evidence, in other words, facts, scientific evidence, observation, measurement, and reasoning confirmed by independent observers. And just for fun, I believe in anything, no matter how wild and ridiculous, if there's evidence for it. The wilder and more ridiculous something is, however, the firmer and more solid the evidence will have to be. Good wisdom, and we try to practice that in my language methods. Here are some policy ideas, and in a way, I think I've handled them, so I won't go as far as reading the text here. I did say that you need to have a specific, I would say, written, approved, the powers that be are behind it and care about it, policy. Do you really have a prioritization policy? I'm guessing most of you have an organization which does not have a clear prioritization policy for example, the agile delivery. For example, if I were to do something at NAV, the Social Security Administration in Norway, I would have a policy that says real NAV values for the critical NAV stakeholders will be delivered measurably every month. And we will not build large IT systems and fail to deliver such values. Okay, that would be my policy at large government institutions. They seem to think that if they do agile programming, everything's fine. This morning, I had a man from NAV at a meeting agreed with the principle that we should prioritize delivering value to stakeholders. So that's a good start. But I fear that NAV has not been practicing that very well. Whereas the health organizations in COVID have been practicing that very well, or we'd all soon be dead. So it's possible to practice it in large political organizations. For example, what is the priority in COVID? Is it saving lives of the older people? That's why I got my shot today, because I'm 80 years old. Okay. Is it opening up for the economic factors in society, jobs, at the expense of lives? Okay, so COVID gives many good examples of this competing priorities, and finally, decisions which are made explicitly for one or the other priority. Compare Sweden to Norway in their prioritization and their results, for example. So enough of that, but it needs to be written, but it also you need to have an agile priority policy. That is, there will be circumstances which are so extreme and so surprising that the general policy, the everyday policy, isn't going to be a good one. What if, for example, suddenly all the vaccines couldn't be delivered, and you were now 8 months late with all the vaccines compared to any plan? I think your priorities are going to have to change as a result of such radical things, which we've seen small signs of. Here's one of the world's richest men competing with Mr. Musk for the pleasure, and I like his way of thinking, but he basically says that it's another version of what you all know as fail fast and learn, which is agile. But he's saying if you're going to invent stuff, you're going to have to experiment. You experiment, you're going to fail. And if you're going to fail, you can't just bet the shop on this month's failure. You have to think long term. And obviously, he's done that. So very interesting. Here's another, almost a remark. I believe in modeling, that my impact estimation table is a form of modeling the architecture in relation to its costs and its values. Even the quantification of the values is a form of modeling of the values. Talk about that. But I believe that these methods, as much as I seem to talk them up here, have their limitations. I believe it's essential to move very quickly, for example, within the first week on a new project, to getting some feedback from reality. That means doing the first sprint on the second week of a project, no matter how large. Okay. And getting feedback and continuing to get feedback, because reality beats modeling. All kinds of estimations and models, useful up to a point, but you have to, as quickly as possible, confront your models and estimates with reality and start adjusting your prioritization, above all, based on the realities being fed back to you. How good is the architecture for delivering values? What does the architecture really cost? Do the stakeholders, are they thrilled with it? Or are they beginning to rebel on you and complain to the government that you're not following European law? Okay, so the earlier, the better. So one British professor had a wonderfully vulgar way of saying this: suck it and see. Okay, very simple. Here's an example from this kind of prioritization. This is done in Norway in 2003 by Confirmit, which is at Skøyen in Oslo. And this is a simple impact estimation table done on a spreadsheet. This is one parallel group. They had 16 developers divided into 4 teams of about 4 people. And this 4-person team working on the survey engine is doing this quality, this quality, this quality, this quality, etc., of this value. The tolerable level, the minimum level, is stated numerically here. The goal or sufficient or success level is stated here. But they're into their 9th out of 12 weeks before a quarterly delivery to the world market. And here's the feedback. Here's the percentage of achievement of goal. So 100 means they've achieved this goal. 146 means they've more than achieved the goal. 97 means they've almost achieved the goal. Okay. And 13 means far from it. Okay. So here you can see priorities. I mean, for example, 0, they've got 3 more weeks before they have to deliver all of these. It's time to prioritize working on this. And that's why the spreadsheet was programmed to give a little red signal saying, alarm, worry about this. And green means, don't worry, what me worry, no problem, they're already there. Don't spend any resource on it. So this is automatic computation and feedback of the priorities based on the feedback compared to the goals. Okay, this spreadsheet was whipped up by Trond Johansen one evening at home. Okay, so it's that simple. And the definition of 25 quantified values was done in a week. Okay, with no training whatsoever, 1 day of briefing and then reading our books. So but all the people working there were graduates of the Norwegian Trondheim NTNU University. In other words, they were proper engineers. And so they understood this engineering method and the value of doing it, and they just went straight and did it. They were so successful that they blew their international competition out of the water and destroyed them and took them over. That's a nice little success story of using these methods in practice. And that was 2003. Okay. 10 more minutes. Okay. So here are some we call advantages from the prioritization using the dynamic fact-based prioritization. And one of them is you can launch and start delivering almost immediately practical results for your organization, for your stakeholders. It didn't say you're going to code any code whatsoever. Okay. You're going to have constant control over the profitability of your project, since you hopefully have some kind of a values to costs policy. Therefore, you're constantly choosing the most profitable architectures to deliver. And even though there will be some deviation from your expectations, but there will still be some learning what things really cost, where you then learn to avoid unexpectedly high cost architectures. And there will be some disappointments with regard to delivery of values, but you'll quickly learn and maybe even compensate with better value architecture. So long story short, I'm describing a method that ensures the long-term profitability of agile decision-making. Ask your CEO and chief financial officer whether they would like a method that guarantees the profitability of your IT projects, or whether they want to do it the old way, which is notoriously failure prone. Look it up, Google IT agile project failure rates. Okay. But I don't think management's ever been asked or shown a method for actually doing this. Tell me if you know of other methods that try to do this, okay? And let's see, so another advantage is that as you deliver and measure results compared to your estimates or expectations, you are building up facts about architecture. You're learning how the architecture, which may be new and may be untried, maybe completely new products or methods, new stakeholders you've never dealt with before, new types of costs you have to worry about, such as the CPU cycles of an artificial intelligence system. So you're going to build up real knowledge. So you're going to make smarter and better prioritization decisions. Okay, and a whole lot of other stuff. Let's see, I do actually have time. No, I don't think I'll go through that. Okay, so last slide. Here's an example. I was working with a man who did a startup in Oslo, and it was a one-man startup, but he jumped in, did the method excellently. I was quite surprised. And then he discovered something which he showed to me. Basically, these are his different architectures, if you like. And he discovered there were some architectures right here that had virtually no value to cost. These are value to cost ratios. Okay, in other words, values delivered for costs. And he discovered there was a whole lot of very low value to cost things. And then he said, my goodness, I was thinking of spending the first 6 months of my startup in these areas, which would give me practically nothing. That's ridiculous. My own estimates say that if I deal with this one and this one, I'll be spending my time more profitably. I'm, after all, only one guy. I haven't got infinite funding, infinite time, and infinite people. My own estimates have told me that I've been thinking wrongly about what I should be doing in the early stages of my endeavor. So one old client of mine used to stand up and hold lectures about what he'd learned from me, and said, Tom, you taught me how to think. And I'm a little bit surprised because I knew he could think before I met him, but he meant how to think so that my intuitive ideas, when they're bad, get exposed as bad intuitive ideas, and then the fact-based, logic-based, multidimensional thinking leads me to better thinking about how I should use my time in the early phases of my startup. So that's the end of that chapter. Then we have 5 minutes for reviewing it. Let me just maybe do that orally. Prioritization is not something that on a larger complex system, you should use fixed weights and subjective weights by anonymous people. That may be appropriate for very simple systems like discussing what your work is going to be the next 2 or 3 weeks and putting a fixed priority on it. That I don't have a problem with that. But when you're building something like the Norwegian health system, or a part of it, such as Axon, one patient, one ledger, or one record, then it's far more complex, long-term, and costly. And we need more sophisticated methods, and I'm suggesting all stakeholder values are quantified. And minimum levels are stated, as well as final success levels. And the architect's job is to guarantee the minimum levels with architecture, and pretty much guarantee, but maybe have to adjust things as you go along, reaching the goals on time. Okay, and we can keep track of the feedback from the agile delivery steps, and use that feedback step by step to understand and determine our priorities. 13.3 priority, 0.0 priority. Okay, that means get your team focused on using time, people, money on achieving these goals, which are not achieved. Okay, so that's the basic idea. In other words, do you believe in logic? Do you believe in facts? Not every, you might say, what's a silly question, Tom? I said, not everybody does. Okay, there's a president being tried who doesn't seem to believe in science, for example, and he's done very well, and he's, after all, a multi-billionaire, or is he? Or is that a fact? Maybe not. Okay, so let's say half of human culture isn't very concerned about science, engineering, logic, or systematic thinking. They just want to, I don't know, have their dinner at 5 o'clock and get home and be safe and get their pension. Okay, but there is a reason for the high failure rates of our IT projects, such as the large Norwegian government projects. And I believe the reason is lack of this kind of prioritization, values to costs, lots of feedback and learning. And I believe this is a set of tools which will reduce the probability or the degree of failure of even very large, very complex systems, if only people would listen to it and stop doing their silly little Scrum user story-based thinking. Okay, so that's my summary. Now, next Tuesday, we're going to look at the prioritized flow of measurable values to stakeholders. Okay, and this is an agile method, which I call EVO, which is short for evolutionary or evolutionary value optimization. And if you like, it's an agile method, but it is based on all these quantified values and costs and feedback and things like that. So that's what's going to happen next Tuesday, is we're going to look at EVO chapter 6, if you wish to read ahead. Well, all done within the hour. If it was overwhelming, that's not improbable, but you've got a text to read, and you've got extended text to read in the value planning chapters I've given you. And now it's questions and answer time. So I'm going to take a look at who's on the people grid and listen to questions. Would somebody say something so I know I can hear you?
Yeah, it's
okay.
I'm thinking that's it. So maybe give someone else some chance to ask some questions.
Sure. And what if we got a Norwegian to ask a question or make a remark or challenge? That would be something.
Maybe while people are thinking questions, maybe I can ask one. You talked about.
Tommy did put up his finger,
Yeah.
but go ahead.
Yeah. No.
Sure, go ahead. But Tommy next.
I thought about that conform it slide, or
confirm it.
And I was thinking, if you're going to kind of like re-evaluate every week, you need to do kind of automated measurements.
Yes. Well, not necessarily, but the principle of what you're saying is correct. The faster, and if you have a week, you can't use 3 weeks to measure. Okay. Now, in fact, there is something like a parallel shadow week of testing, which gives feedback. So they don't literally do everything and then do complete testing in the week. So I think all forms of testing generally took a week. But they did say to me at one point that they said that the testing should be designed or architected and simplified so it never took more than a half an hour per week. Okay, and I don't know all the details. What they did is they simply said, of course, this will go at the expense of accuracy and credibility, but we can't spend 6 months measuring things. We need feedback pretty close to the end of the week. So they had a combination of deciding to have simplified measures. In other words, leading indicators rather than lagging indicators. You know about that. And finally, they found that some forms of testing did demand a full week of proper testing, say systems integration testing, and they gave it that time, and the feedback did come a little bit later. So good question, and I hope the answer was interesting. By the way, the case study on Confirm It is in the references, and there was a special paper, I forget whether it's in the references or not without looking, but we have a special paper on the testing culture at Confirm It. If you don't find it and you request it by email, I'll give you if you're interested in the testing and measurement at Confirm It, I can send you the paper quite easily. This is a really leading technology. This is like extremely advanced agile in Norway, 2003. And most of the other Norwegians doing agile are still don't even understand these ideas of quantifying values and costs and dealing with. They're still at the level of, in fact, they were on the meeting this morning, they're still bragging about moving from Scrum, which is code oriented, to being systems oriented. We were systems oriented at Confirm It in 2003. Thank you very much. So, Tommy, are you happy for the moment? Or
Thank you. Thank you.
Pleasure.
Interesting.
Next. Don't be shy. Love to have your questions. Oh, and remember, there's my email on the screen. I hope you can see it, tom@gilb.com. And I'm quite happy to answer questions, tonight. I will be looking at the impeachment, but I can answer your questions while watching the impeachment. So ask me your questions, you shy Norwegians, by email anytime. But getting them orally means we can share the answers with other people right here and now.
There was an interesting comment in the chat that agile means we do stand-up meetings and sprints. Because a lot of people that do agile, it's really just cargo cult. They're doing the retrospectives and the sprint planning and the daily stand-ups and stuff like this. But they're just going through the motions. They're not really doing agile. They're just doing all the sort of cargo cult type sets.
And more people are recognizing that and trying to do something with it. So that was being discussed at the Agile meetup this morning in Norway. And I'm discovering all kinds of groups that are going way beyond that today. But there's still a lot of people stuck in the old simplified Agile. Their main objective seems to be able to say, I'm doing Agile. The other is to be able to say, I've got a certificate about Agile. And that's, but I always ask simple questions at these meetings. And it is, can you tell me some numbers, some facts about how much better your organization is because you're using your kind of Agile? And do you think I ever get an answer from anybody? Actually, today, the NAV people put up a chart saying how much better they were getting because they were using XP in the last 3 or 4 years. But the chart was just in delivered code. So I made a remark. I said, delivered code is not the same as NOV got better for the NOV users. And I got an email back from the guy who said it. He said, I agree with you completely, Tom, but it is an indicator. See, so there's some progress there. It's what happens to the real organization that counts, not stand-up meetings or any other cargo cult artifact. Let's be clear about it. So my focus is totally on how are we going to measure the good that happens to the organization, which is defined as the stakeholders. That is, the customers are part of the organization, in case that didn't seem apparent.
As you mentioned also in the beginning, there's something about that there's some things that have to be there. You know, the chapters, the survival stuff. You know, that I find in most projects I work on, I'm actually in. That's the area I'm in all the time. You know,
trying to survive.
Yeah, trying to. Yeah, there's some things the organization must do. For example, NAV must know how much pension they should pay you. Yeah. So your pension rights. So then, for example, keeping track of your pension rights is something that they must do. There's no choice.
No. Okay. Now, in my earlier lectures, when I was talking about constraints, I made a very careful distinction between two types of constraints. One is the one I was talking about today with the tolerable level on a value scale. Okay. So that's what I call a scalar constraint. And in other words, we must have a sufficient quantity of the values and something corresponding to that in the resources. Now, there's another kind of constraint, like it must be legal in according to European Union law. That's not a scalar constraint. You're either legal or illegal. That's called a binary constraint. So, but the architect has to respect all constraints, whether they're binary or scalar. But the binary ones need to be respected by the architecture at the outset. You cannot start building Smitestop and violate GDPRS on day one, which in fact they did, okay? That's not a matter of degree. That was a matter of legal fact that Norway has committed to this and the government agreed with it, okay? But on the other hand, if the Smitestop app doesn't have a certain quantity in the population, like if only 5% of Norwegians adopt it, then there's a minimum level everybody talks about. I think it's 2/3 of the population have to adopt the app before it'll really help. Yeah, that's a tolerable level. Obviously, we'd like to get to maybe higher levels, but we must at least get to, let's say, 2/3 of the population using it before it has its overall effect. Anyway, make a distinction between the two types of constraints, both of which the architect must respect. The binary constraints from the outset. You must not suggest an architecture that violates European law if you're subject to European law, end of discussion. But the other kind of constraint, you might only learn gradually, step by step, that you have not reached the 2/3 necessary of population for using the app. And then you have to put in tactics like we'll pay people 1,000 kroner if they'll download the app or something like that to change your architecture so that you reach your minimum levels. Next question or remark? Just turn your microphone on.
Hi, Lars. Here.
Hi, Lars.
I also attended this morning's meetup.
Yes.
And I think the two speakers from NAV made a good presentation, and somehow they managed to adapt to the situation. In what manner do you think they use your methods or parts of your methods, or did they manage without thinking the way you do?
Okay. Now, as I said, the speaker, I agree they had a very good talk. And I've told you that by email, in other words, outside the meeting, the major speaker there agreed with my proposition that merely delivering code very rapidly as in his chart, is not a primary thing that NAV should be interested in. They should be interested in delivering value to stakeholders. He completely agreed with that, but that was, you didn't see that because it was a private email to me, but I do have a copy of it, okay? Now, to answer your question, I believe that NAV and other government institutions such as health, they are not stating a set of quantified values for the critical stakeholders of NAV, of the health services, and they're not architecting to meet those levels, and they're not doing agile to month by month actually deliver improvement to NAV and their stakeholders. They're focused on delivering an IT system. Okay, that's the problem. Okay.
But one of the stakeholders is a person without employment.
Yes.
And they got their money, didn't they? During this spring.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, so they succeeded in some way in delivering an IT system that had value for at least some stakeholders.
Yeah. Now, again, if you deliver some code and that code has a knock-on effect that some people will get their money, then you are delivering value, but the value isn't the code. It's the fact that they got money. We have to distinguish between a technical prerequisite for getting results in real life.
I agree. Yes.
Okay, we agree. But I find this understanding this knock-on effect of IT at a higher level is something that the government doesn't really do. Now, they do in the COVID situation, by the way, but they don't do it in some of these large projects that have gone on forever and consumed billions and failed very publicly. There's a complete absence of delivering value to society. Otherwise, there would not be a failure and there would not be complaints. They've been delivering code. Okay? We've got to get away from delivering code. We've got to say that even if you deliver, we've got to go to systems thinking and say delivering code isn't the only form of architecture to achieve things in a medical system for Norway. There might be things like training more emergency nursing staff. Okay, we're just too narrowly solving everything as an IT problem, and we've got to solve the larger problem of delivering benefits to stakeholders, not delivering code. And so there's a lot of IT people out there that don't get it, and a lot of managers and ministers who don't get it yet. And look at the failure rates which are published for Norwegian and international IT systems. We're at the 40% total failure plus 45% partial failure for everything we do for the last several decades. There's something very, very wrong with what we do. That's my major concern. It's the failure rate. Failure means failures to deliver critical values to critical stakeholders. We don't have a problem delivering code.
But Tom, do you think the failure rate has risen, or has it fallen during the last 10, 20, or 30 years?
Okay. Now, there are plenty of international surveys published free immediately. If you Google failed or disaster IT projects, you'll find quite a lot, tens of thousands. But on the first page, you'll find the chaos survey done by a consultancy. I forget the name for the moment. Now, what they show is that the failure rates have always been in order of magnitude 30 to 60% total failure, depending on industry and type of project. And they have gone a little bit up and a little bit down through time, but basically they've not gone down from 30% to 3%. They've gone from 30% down to 25 and up to 37. Now, it turns out when you compare waterfall projects with agile projects, agile is slightly better. Okay, But slightly better means the total failure rate is like 25% instead of 30, which is not good enough. It's ridiculous. The reason Agile succeeds better is because of the shorter feedback, giving people signals at an earlier stage that something is wrong. Okay, but we're not managing the feedback cycle well enough. All we know is everybody hates it or something like that. We don't know that we tried to deliver a value to the unemployed and they didn't, they only got part of it or something like that. We should be managing factors like that. But look it up. Failure rates are well published. They have not essentially changed for decades, and they are horribly, embarrassingly large. I think it's embarrassing to say I have anything to do with IT people and the IT business, but our failure rates are horrendously large. And we're Agile and Scrum and SAFe have not changed the situation at all in any important way.
Tom, one question. How do you view XP as an agile practice?
How do I
View, how do you see, is it a good agile practice to follow the principles and the practices that it suggests?
Okay, I'm trying to get the question. How do I see or view the agile practices of other people or my own agile practices?
So there's an agile practice of extreme programming.
Okay.
So
Now,
how do you view that?
Yeah, okay. Now, extreme programming is a very good set of practices for people producing code, okay? That's why they've been reintroducing them to NAV the last 3 years, okay? But they are, but these software agile practices are not good enough for managing systems like a national health service. They're not designed to do it. They never were. Okay. So we need agile practices for large, complex systems, such as government, health, and social security systems, and large corporations. And these agile practices were not designed for that. Again, the discussion this morning was people were saying, I hope we're getting the right meaning, that they were trying to break away from being code-centric to dealing with systems. That was the big news this morning. That's ridiculous, okay? I think I broke away from that 50 years ago and was always, my methods are always doing systems of any scale or size, okay? So in other words, what we need to get away from is the code-centric programmers of the world. And we need to do agile by delivering value incrementally, rapidly, frequently, a value stream to the stakeholders of large systems. It's not about code and it's not about programming. And pretending like it is for so many years is embarrassing. That people go on thinking it. Did I answer your question, sort of?
Yes.
Okay. Again, I've written a great deal on it. So if you email me, I'll send you a signature with all my agile writings, which go into great detail on what for example, a systematic analysis of what's wrong with the Agile Manifesto. Okay. That's a book called Value Agile, which is free. I think you'll find a link to that book, Value Agile, in the references in our architecture book, by the way, if anybody wants to go straight to that. That's a good summary of my views on Agile and the Agile Manifesto in particular. Nothing wrong with the manifesto for small enough projects, not good enough for Norwegian government projects.
maybe say something about this, the focus on code, you know, in extreme programming.
Yeah.
And clean code, you know, so sometimes there's a lot of focus about cleaning up the code and restructuring it and things like this. But if the code does what it's supposed to do, and you're not going to change it, then there's no need to improve it.
There might
Yeah.
be, because of performance characteristics and security characteristics.
Yeah.
etc.
Yeah. But then there's a need to change it. But
Yeah.
if there's no need to change it, and it's sitting there, then it's not really that.
Sure.
So a lot of people, they're very code. That's why a lot of developers, they like to write frameworks, because then they themselves are the customer. So they don't have to talk to the customer, you know. So that's
okay. Again, we need good code craftsmanship, no doubt. Our technical debt problems bear witness to bad code craftsmanship everywhere for a long time. But the problem I'm trying to take up is, it's not about code or good code. It's about good value delivery to society, to the corporation, to the health service. And in other words, systems thinking is what it's all about. And we need to, so we need agile. That is, we need step-by-step delivery of value, so we get critical value delivered early. And so we get feedback on the cost and actual value delivery of any given architecture. Okay, we need agile architecture for systems. Okay, but I almost suggest a separation. The coders over here and people going to deliver value to society, cooperating with them and ordering services for them. But let's not kid ourselves that solving health problems in Norway is done by excellent extreme programming.
But there's a good example of something like this in the Unicorn Project book. That the systems has collapsed and nothing's working. But over in the corner, there is a developer that's just taking the next user story and coding that, and not thinking about the whole. It's like he's making the beds on the Titanic because that's his job, while the Titanic is sinking.
Yeah. So a lot of people are just doing their job. I understand that. I think the big problem is it's not the programmers of the world. It's the government ministers and directors of health that have not been educated to understand what they should be doing. And the reason for that is the professors didn't know, and the professors didn't teach them. And this is an example of society still trying to catch up with the technology. Okay, it's what I cited earlier, that society has problems catching up with the rate of technological change. So we can blame technological change if we like. Okay, but we have to try to catch up now. We're not good at it.
Tom,
yes,
all the sessions that I have attended, the most important part has been quantification of the values.
Yes.
So how can I read ahead? How do you quantify those values?
Okay. You will find a book in the references called Quantiering, How to Quantify Any Qualities or Values. Free. I wrote it this summer. Quantiering. Now, that's the one thing, but the other thing is that I almost give a summary of those ideas in this book. So we're almost there, aren't we? Yeah. Okay. So see, it says here, detailed value requirement, chapter 10. And so chapter 10 in this book will give you a lot of information about how to quantify the values. And maybe I have to discuss it with OSWA. We will run sessions on chapter 10, 11, 12, 13. We'll see how everything tastes by the time we're at 9. But failing that, it is here in detail. And even more specialized in the quantiering book. And almost all the books I write, like the value planning book, there is a chapter on that. The free competitive engineering book, there are chapters on that. So almost everything I write, if you look around for quantification of quality or quantification of value, you will find things. And if anybody's in any doubt about it, email me. I will send you the essentials of that. But I think everybody's got this book here, so why not read chapter 10 as a starter to go into more detail. But it's a very simple idea. If values are critical, but we bullshit them, like we want more security, that's bullshit. Rather than saying we want 95% probability of detecting a hacker within 5 seconds, that's not bullshit. That's a clear idea. Maybe a wrong idea, but it's a clear idea. So clarity of purpose, clarity of values is an essential foundation for everything like project success and the architecture that goes with it. Okay, so you're right. Value clarity is the foundation of my whole discipline here. And that's a problem because these ministers and directors are constantly bullshitting everything about their project, maybe because it's a nice soundbite for television, but somebody has to finally, if not necessarily the minister or director themselves, but before we start investing 22 billion kroner on an Axon project, somebody should quantify the values we're going to deliver to society and publish them, and publish the fact that we may adjust them as we go along and learn. Okay, but they're not doing that. They're publishing the cost, the time, and the fact that PwC would like to have all the action. I think the government decided there was something funny about that. It was about spending money for at least 8 years. Okay, what is the value for society? What happens to health if you get one patient, one journal? What happens to my health? That's what I want to know.
I think before they used to estimate the value of a life in Norway, I think it was 2 million kroners.
I'm worth more than that.
Yeah, but they have to use it when they're doing road projects, they are the benefit is the reduction in fatalities on the roads.
Yeah,
and then they're looking at how much money do you need to save to save one life.
Yeah. Different lives, different values.
Yeah.
I'll give you more than 2 million for my life.
Yeah, but it's also there's a big difference in there's some things where you accept that people die and something where you don't.
We do.
There's a much greater acceptance for people dying in road traffic than airplanes.
Right.
If there's an airplane,
look at all the people we've accepted dying in COVID in some countries. Fortunately, not this one. Anyway, 7:30, and probably a good idea to stop on time. Anybody who has more questions, very welcome to send them by email to me. Answer probably this evening. And welcome back to the next session where we'll learn about the agile method known as EVO for delivering values to stakeholders, which is accumulation of all these things I've been talking about up to now. But it's actually the project management part is another way of putting it. So thank you. See you Tuesday, 4 o'clock.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, lads.
Thank you.